line that Michael had on his display, because if it doesn't work, nobody's going to use it, and they'll find that out pretty quickly. So the first challenge before you even get to interoperability is to simply get stuff to work reliably. Once you have several instances of things that work reliably, then you'll get pressure from the consumers for interoperability because they don't want to have to learn to control things in 16 different ways. And so there may be a very regular and natural progression towards commonality that is forced on the manufacturers by consumers who say, I don't want to buy any more of your stuff unless it interworks with other stuff. And there's a good example of this in the internet space, because before the internet was designed, there were computer networks that were proprietary from IBM and Digital and HP. And they were eager not to implement TCP/IP commercially, despite the fact that their research arms had done so as an experiment. And it was at the point where the consumers or customers of their equipment basically said, we won't buy your equipment unless it works with other people's equipment. And so the pressure came from the buyers.
Just to go a little further on that, the area of home networks is a really good example of how things didn't work right. Vint gave us an example of where everybody finally coalesced around TCP/IP because it worked and because everyone saw the benefits. In home networking, we've had this terrible situation where 5 or 6 different proprietary standards, conscious efforts to make sure that things don't interoperate. Yeah, that's starting to change, luckily, but it added a huge amount of expense, and it held us back probably 5 or 10 years at least. And so we have to somehow keep that steady pressure towards open, non-proprietary standards. Big purchasers can certainly be a driver here. Governments, through their dollars, their procurement dollars, can push. So can Walmart. When Walmart decided to set certain standards for RFID tags so that they could control their pallet loads, their supply chains, that pushed tens of thousands of companies to get on the game, get on with it, move from barcodes to RFID tags. So it takes a little vision, takes a little leadership from some of the big players, but also it takes companies that have an interest in the long term and understand that whereas the proprietary approach might get them 100% of a very small market, if they open it up, work with other players, they might get 10% of a market that's 100 times bigger.
Yeah, my guess as to what's going to happen is for things in buildings that interoperate with each other, we're going to see over the next few years maybe 3 or 4 different clusters of technology standards that where devices interoperate fairly well within them, but not very well between them. So much as we have with telephones or computer operating systems and such. That's not the most desirable outcome, but that's my guess as to what is going to happen.
Excuse me, there was another speaker here, she'd probably say, well, there's an app for that, and that's how we connect everything. But first and foremost, I'm still an architect, and too much, the reason we don't have nice interoperability is a lot of times things happen from a architecture or architecture on PowerPoint. We draw a couple big boxes and we draw the lines and a few arrows and like, okay, this is my design, and we hand it off to engineering. And it's really about 1,000 questions about, well, what, who should it talk to, or what protocol should I run, and how should I collect information? There's, the basic security tenets or the basic privacy tenets. You saw some privacy stuff earlier. We didn't really talk about a lot of security tenets, but it really goes back to we need to architect in a secure way, build it in, but we also need to do that efficiently and rapidly. And I think many companies in the valleys still haven't adopted standard architecture frameworks. There's like 14 or 15 of those. But so we're actually looking at it from the big picture and not just really focused effort about what can this new cool gadget gizmo do.
I think it's also important to realize that there are different needs at different layers in the stack. And what we see too often is people sort of saying, well, we need one standard to solve it all. But you really do need different solutions at different places. And applications standards are very different than protocol standards for the network itself.
I'd like to echo those comments as well from a privacy perspective, of course, looking at trusted computing, that we're going to be sharing data between devices, but between consumers, that whatever open standards are adopted, keeping in mind security in transit, how that information is captured and ultimately stored.
I think what ultimately happens is that consumers create the standards, that the people who really pay for the development of the standards ends up being the people who have the money and are buying the products. And I think that even sort of goes back to the origin of the internet. The government paid for development of the internet. It paid for it not because they wanted to make money at it, but because they wanted to consume it. I think that the same sort of thing ends up happening with standards in general. Standards are adopted, whether they're technically better or not than other ways of doing things. They're adopted because they turn out to be most advantageous to the consumers. I think it happens naturally. I think it happens organically. What would be nice would be if people can sort of recognize this ahead of time and facilitate it by getting out of the way.
And just on that, we talked about, open, reusable building blocks for standards. We talk about it a lot at ISOC. Concept talked about it at the IETF. Again, another good thing that people want to see happen. If we're too early in the cycle and people are just going to fight out standard stuff now, what role, or is there anything that can be done about education, about reusable building blocks, anything that can be done to help people start thinking about components of standards? Maybe rather than sort of total standards packages that might be able to be pushed forward. Is there any type of outreach or education? What can be done in terms of thinking about standards in the right way with the market?
I don't think we're intentionally going to go from one end of the thing to the other here. So anybody who wants to should jump in. Actually, it's not too late. It's amazing how ideas can come along. Somebody recognizes an opportunity to build a module which has all the right interfaces on it. It sort of encapsulates all the funny stuff and then shows some nice standardized interfaces, and it puts that out there either because it was just for free or because it was a product that somebody wanted to sell that enabled other people to build things. I think that what may happen is that as we go through this period of proliferation, we will begin to see what works and what doesn't work, and what consumers like and what they don't like. And out of that may emerge some ideas for standard building blocks. And so I would not put that out of the realm of possibility.
The other things that are happening is that we are seeing a shift from every company and even every individual running their own hardware and updating their own software to the platforms that are now being used by millions of companies to run their business. Whether that platform is a social media service or various types of e-commerce platforms, or further down the stack, it's something like CloudFlare, which provides more efficient delivery of bits. When you have these platforms, it's, I think, a lot easier for the technology to move faster and for new ideas and new standards to be tested and plugged into these platforms. Maybe different platforms will try out different technologies, but in the end, it is going to be a race to the best. And I think because of that, we're going to make more progress more quickly. And it's going to be easier to design in privacy, update the different pieces of the platform in a faster product cycle. So I'm pretty optimistic. I mentioned earlier what CloudFlare has done to implement IPv6 and to roll out better, I mean, but in 2 years, we've done what's happened, we've done so much just as one company, 240 people. And there's more to come on that front, and it's because we don't have to get 10 million people to do something. Those 10 million people are already using our services. Boom.
So we'll kind of bump the way here. So part of me really wants to believe, and I somewhat agree with Michael that I can say this. So when my youngest grandkids and great-grandkids, I have 2, are in their 20s, they'll be going like, what was the big deal? We did it. Because I'm sure I know me sitting here, I can think back to the 80s and our first technology, which was kind of clunky. We're here, we did it. But the other part of me, the realistic, I think the way we get there initially, because when we think about standards, everybody's eyes kind of roll back and it's really hard to do, and let's have 15 or 16 standards. If we could just start with principles. You talk about privacy principles, we have architecture tenets. If we can just say, here's the good neighbor, 5 things every sensor should or should not do, that's easier for people to grasp, even common consumers, because I really think the consumer industry is kind of driving us in terms of what we need. And and that coupled with the fact that we're getting more and more data and we're learning, maybe the computers will actually, they'll learn and figure out how we adopt the standards out of all the principles that we collect.
Yeah, if you look at the membership of these sort of more recent standards or organizations like All-Seen and OIC, the one company which seems to show up on all of them is Samsung. And my sense, and I have no connection to Samsung, is that they really actually believe in trying to get everything to work together and will work as a company to try to do that across these silos. And because I think they sell so many products, they figure, well, we'll sell a lot of products regardless, but if we can grow the whole market, like you were talking about, that they can sell more product that way. So I think they're a really interesting one to watch.
It's really the difference between the IBM model, where they licensed their operating system, and the Apple model, where they were going to control every device that ran Apple. And IBM won. Microsoft won bigger because they ran on IBM.
Yeah, Samsung actually had a pretty significant announcement at the Consumer Electronics Show in support of interoperability and announcements that 80 or 90% of their product line they thought would be IoT enabled by 2020. So pretty significant statements coming out of Samsung. It'll be interesting to see what their interoperability push does for the rest of the market.
And I'd like to echo those comments as well. Vint had a great slide. He showed the living room of the future, and there wasn't brand names in that picture. That when we think about interoperability and we think of standards, I think of interacting with the Internet of Things, not necessarily through apps and not necessarily through brand names, but having a ubiquitous, seamless interaction with all the things in my life, and having the complexity, the protocols, the standards behind the scenes. And I think that's what consumers expect the future to be.
They just want it to work. There is an interesting dynamic that in the case of the internet, there was a company that Dan Lynch started called Interop, which stood for interoperability. And the deal was, if you showed up on the show floor and hooked into their Ethernet, you had to demonstrate that your system worked with everybody else on the net. And what was interesting is that a lot of bugs got sorted out as a result right there on the show floor. So maybe we need to have some sort of an interop for the Internet of Things.
Yeah, interesting.
I think that's actually a great idea. What I was going to say was, I think we need to beware of expecting anything to happen because it's the right thing to happen. The establishment of standards, establishment of the building blocks that go to make up standards, I think it organically is going to end up being piecemeal, and I think money is going to end up driving it. Whoever pays for development of the individual pieces that everybody likes, those are the pieces that are going to have a chance of getting any traction, and particularly when there are pieces that not only the customers but also the vendors find attractive. They save the vendors money, they add value to the customers. It's an irresistible combination. And I think that's when standards really start to bite, is when they have support at both ends.
But it's key that we subdivide and that we don't get these vertical sector-specific standards that go from the network layer all the way up to the app layer. We have to build piece by piece so that we have minimal standards at each layer that they can build on each other.
I've had experience with efforts to build protocols that solve entire problems. And,
Right.
And I'm glad those experiences are behind me at the moment.
Well, that's what happened in a lot of the home networks.
If anybody wants to join the conversation, just come to the mic.
Go ahead. All right, go ahead. Yes. Just to talk about, it seems to me that the U.S. as a government tends to ignore its standards. Europe as a government tends to pay for its standards. And China, as example, as a government tends to promote its standards. I see a great deal of new standards emerging from that very large market that promotes its standards. And I wonder what the panelists would comment.
Well, one thing for sure, that in the U.S., because we had a very large market in the internet space, we were able to build a set of standards just based on our domestic market. And in China, we may see the same thing happen because the size of their domestic market is very big and growing. And since they make a lot of this stuff in the first place, it's not implausible that a lot of Chinese equipment will wind up setting de facto standards. And I think your point is, if that was the point you were making, I think it was well made.
Anybody else? All right, let me shift to another topic. Michele, in your presentation, you had a slide that says that consumer demand has surpassed security implementation measures, and that consumers just buy the products regardless. It reminded me of the Dead Kennedys album, punk rock band, 1980s, Los Angeles. Their seminal record, "Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death." We say a lot that trust is needed. Trust, consumers need to trust in order to buy these products. They need to trust security, they need to trust privacy. But people keep buying. So what explains that? Is that a paradox? What do we have to do to get privacy, greater privacy and greater security into these products if consumers don't seem to be asking for it or factoring that into their decision making?
Such a true statement. And I think it goes back to, it has to be, personally, we all have to take our own actions and make a stand, or it's just not going to happen. And there will be those people who don't care because they want the convenience. I had a very recent example over the last week. I have an organization that's asked, I'm getting an award and they're going to give me some money. So they sent me a form and they wanted my information. And so, here's the PDF documents, so I opened the PDF documents, I started filling out, my name, my address, my SSN. I'm thinking, well, how do I get this to them, right? I could scan it, I could sign it, scan it, attach it back. Like, no, that's not the good thing to do. Well, I could fax it, but where's the fax? Oh, well, this is a small organization. How are they actually storing my PII? And so I called this other person who wasn't the one that asked for the information. I'm like, I need to know how I can get this to you because it's my social security number and it's my personal address and it's my phone number. And if you just had my driver's license, you could open credit cards. And she's like, well, that's a really good question. We hadn't exactly thought about that. And so it's an inconvenience in that how do I do it? I can't necessarily walk over to their office because, I'm entrusting them with my social security. and it's a, small shop. And so most people probably would have just wrote it in and sent it off and not thought about it. And so that's where I think, and I go back to, you talked about what education and awareness, I think enough people have been hacked, or they know people that have been hacked, and that's the statistics. You've either been hacked or you know someone that's been hacked, and you've lost stuff. That we just really need to take a stand. Until individuals as consumers take the stand and don't buy stuff, there is a trade-off. I don't use Siri because I actually read the entire Cisco policy that says you will not use iCloud, you will not use Siri. My husband's like, why don't you just talk to Siri? And I'm like, it's not enabled. I can type in the address and bring it up. Yes, it's inconvenient, but we have to make that stand. And then we have to force the vendors and the standards bodies and the powers that be that's not acceptable. And yes, if we try to build something by all the privacy principles Girard told us about, it might be difficult, but we have to find the happy medium or be reserved to the fact there is no privacy. We've all been hacked. It's just the way it is. It's one big happy world of interconnectedness.
One big, happy, overexposed family. When I was working on encryption policy in the Clinton White House, there was an apocryphal story about the Air Force general who was briefed about encryption. And he leaned back and said, well, we'll put encryption on the airplanes when it doesn't cost anything, isn't any hassle, and adds lift to the airplane. So I wasn't surprised 3 years ago when we found out that there were drones over Afghanistan downloading video from the drone to the ground using unencrypted links. It really has to be easy. At CloudFlare, one of our 3 co-founders, Michele Zatlin, has a very interesting title. She is the head of user experience. It's our way of saying that is an incredibly important thing to do. Make it easy, make it reliable, make it easy to understand, and add lift to the airplane.
And I think going to privacy, I mentioned earlier, companies should think about monetizing privacy, that waiting until the next big data breach or security issue relating to an Internet of Things device that has a backlash that we don't want to see. I think consumers are looking for products that advertise in a very simple, way how their information is going to be collected and used. I think that's a way to increase adoption, while at the same time finding that really delicate balance between innovation, right, and legislation. But I think consumers don't know all the information that's contained in these privacy policies. But I think at the end of the day, they want to choose between competing products where they're communicated in such a way that privacy is baked in by design.
Yeah, I may be hopelessly naive, but I tend to think that over time, some companies will try to stake their reputation on privacy and security, and we may see certification procedures or external ratings, and some consumers will choose to pay a premium for devices that are better for privacy and security, and other people who are more price conscious will just buy really crappy devices, and that's how things are going to be. And also, the dead Kennedys were from San Francisco, not Los Angeles.
Oh, that's right. You're absolutely
I saw them
right.
several times, and so I know that.
Yes, sorry. Yes, from San Francisco. You are absolutely right.
X was from Los Angeles.
Okay, yes, all right. Well, we need to talk after this. Go ahead, sorry.
I just wanted to suggest that as important as privacy is, I think ultimately we're going to have to confront the reality that privacy breaches happen all the time, and as much as we can do to protect it, that protection is not going to be perfect. I would like to see us as a society look at a broader picture of minimizing the damage that happens when privacy breaches occur. So, for example, the fact that disclosure of Social Security number can be so damaging is a huge indictment of our financial system, right? We complain about how stupid it is to rely on security by obscurity, and then we say, oh, don't let anybody know your Social Security number. there's something seriously wrong there. And I think it's not just Social Security numbers, plenty of other things where the privacy breaches need not and should not be as damaging as they are.
I want to move this conversation in a different direction for a moment. I've been sitting here thinking about what life is like where I live in Northern Virginia, and apart from the fact that I'm within the radiation belt of the, the White House and the Congress. And I was looking at the number of things that I have to configure on a regular basis. And I'm kind of shocked now that I've made the list. I have 3 autonomous light control systems that are battery driven, and each one of them with micro-sized font. I need a magnifying glass to figure out how to configure it when the battery dies. Then I have a Lutron light control system for some rooms in the house. That needs to be configured. Then I have a custom entertainment system which has been programmed by a guy in Maryland, and whenever it doesn't work, I have to call him to come down and fix it. I've got routers and Wi-Fi base stations scattered around. They have to be configured. My wife has a Tesla. Guess what? Even that has to be configured. Then there's the watering system, and it gets programmed. And there's a DVR that you have to figure out how to program. Then there's microwave and conventional ovens, which also have software controls in them. And then, there's the wireless mesh IPv6 network, which is handling the lighting and temperature and humidity sampling in the house, including the alarm system in the wine cellar. So, I mean, it's a whole bunch of, just a blankety-blank load of stuff. And I'm sitting here thinking, this is awful. And it's only going to get worse unless somebody figures out how to make this a lot more uniform. So the interesting thing about apps, not that I'm a huge app fan, but the interesting thing is if you want to write an app, you don't have to know how the phone works. You absolutely do not have to know anything about the way the mobile phone system works. You just have to meet the API. And so, that should give us a clue about what is got to be the future, or this isn't going to work at all.
You don't have a teenager in the house anymore.
My teenagers departed long ago.
That's the solution to all IT problems.
Actually, could I introduce a different topic?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I work mostly with what I call buildings people, and I'm sort of half a buildings person and half a network person. And buildings people keep wanting to create an operating system for the building. And like a computer has an operating system. But my understanding of networks is that networks don't have operating system. Things are distributed and they have network services and such, but there is no operating system that runs the network for a building. So I think they have the wrong metaphor, and so I think they're sort of chasing down the wrong paradigm to create a quote-unquote centralized building operating system. I wonder what other people on the panel and in the audience think about that.
But the issue, and we see the same thing in spaceflight missions, right? The issue there is you have to trust the individual pieces that way, right? You have to trust the emergent behavior of all of the individual pieces operating autonomously and correctly independently. And that's actually trustworthy. I mean, it's pretty trustworthy because we rely on it in the network all the time. We rely on the phone system all the time. But people think that it's not. People think that they have to be able to predict and control everything that's going to happen and have a single point of control and enforce some sort of determinism in the behavior of the system. And it's a very difficult frame of mind to penetrate.
So where do you come down on building operating system or no building operating system?
Oh, I'm all for distributed systems and emergent behavior, absolutely. If you get the individual, if you get the rules right for the individual pieces, trust the outcome. And if the outcome is bad, then you've got the rules wrong and you go back and fix the rules.
The real problem with the operating system idea, which consists of trying to solve the problem at each of the different layers, is that you're locked in. You've discovered 3 years in, there's a much better way to do this piece of the puzzle. Too bad. Everything's reliant on this operating system you've already built, and everything is centered around that. Much better to have a jigsaw puzzle approach.
I really like your comment about emergent behavior and maybe sort of given the broad depth, the broad scope of the space, of the IoT space, there might be some topics from ideas from complexity theory that might help us along the way in watching this all sort out. Our time is running short, so I'd like to give the panelists one question each, and we can go, or one question for them to each answer. Since we are sitting in Silicon Valley, what topics regarding IoT do you think should be a priority for Silicon Valley to engage in?
Well, I'm going to go back to my primary belief, which is this stuff has to work reliably.
And if I can just build on that, and I think in the mind of most consumers and policymakers, reliable and security are intertwined together. So we really do have to get away from the current world where every week there's another security breach, there's another story about baby monitors or banks losing data. If the first stories that people hear or the first experience they have after they invest in some cool Internet of Things device is being notified that their data has been breached, we're in trouble. So we've got to do a better job. And I think, as I say, partly because we have so many companies that are getting in the business of serving the infrastructure that's going to be at the core of the cloud of all things, the Internet of Things, whatever we want to call it, I think there's a chance we can get it right. But the transparency is key, and a number of companies have come to that realization. When they have an outage, when they have a breach, they tell people as soon as they can. They share half the information if they only have half the information, and they really build trust that way. And I've seen this in company after company. The companies that try to hide, try to do the cover-up until they know all the answers, those are the ones who really lose credibility and lose customers in the long run. In Washington, we always have the saying, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. Whether it was Watergate or, Google's been very responsive in this area. When you have an outage, Amazon as well. When there's a data center that goes down, you get out there and you say, okay, this is where it is. We got the A-team working it, and we don't know exactly how long it'll be until we fix this problem, but we'll get there. CloudFlare has adopted that same approach. We're supporting 4 million websites, and when there's some glitch that affects a few hundred or a few thousand, or on a worst day, a lot more, we are right there on Twitter, on our blog, explaining what's going on. And even though you've had the outage, you can actually gain credibility and gain trust by showing how you solve the problem.
That's only true if it doesn't happen too often.
As Esther Dyson says, always make new mistakes. It's when you make the same mistake 3 times in 3 weeks that people start losing trust.
Yeah, I guess I'll stick to the same point I made in my talk, which just as when PDF was a really good way to represent information that goes onto documents, it took off and became the way it's done. And just as HTML did that for stuff you put onto a screen, I think if we can create good standard ways of describing the physical world that really make a lot of sense, other organizations and companies will flock to it and adopt it, and it will become a de facto standard if it's of a high quality.
Sort of what he said. But I really think, going back to, we need a little bit of simplicity, and if it can happen, I think it can happen here in the Valley, and there are a lot of discussions today, what do we want the future to look like? I talked about a daily scenario in 2017. Well, what does that look like for the different people that work, like a software engineer? I've had to write one of those scenarios too. And then really, what are if we could just start with, as I said, simple basic tenets that would be nice if everybody did these sort of things as a starting point. To have that level set, can we all agree on these, at least have them out there? I think there's a lot of value in that.
I think going back to the privacy principles, looking at consumer trust, I think that'll be key to really allowing the explosion of the IoT field of emerging technologies. I think consumers want to feel safe with the products they're buying, know that their data is going to be protected, and I think that ultimately will lead to greater adoption and a shift to consumers focusing on privacy, and because manufacturers and industry are educating them.
I think the thing that I expect most from Silicon Valley and admire most in Silicon Valley is innovation. And I think that the answer to the question here from my perspective is what should be happening in Silicon Valley is looking as far into the future as absolutely possible. I think it sort of encompasses the other concerns that we've been talking about here, and building systems, building products that are as far ahead of their time as you can afford to do without going out of business, because that's what's really going to advance the technology and ultimately be best for the industry.
Well, great. I think our conversation was 40 minutes, and I think we got some pretty interesting practical ideas. I like the interop idea for IoT. That was really great. We talked a lot about reliability, and one of the common themes here was simplicity. Keep it simple. And when we're talking even about hard problems like security and privacy, sometimes it's good to go back to principles and use that as a framework. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for participating and the speakers as well. I'm going to turn it over to Leah to wrap up the day for us. But just a note in terms of the Internet Society report, we don't have the report here, but there's these cards with information about the report and the web address on the back where you can find it, and they'll be up in the front. And I just want to say thank you, everybody, for this really interesting day and this fun panel.
Thank you very much to the panel and for Karen Rose for moderating the panel. That was very interesting sharing of information.